Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the National Library of Australia. Thank you for joining us in person and online to celebrate a remarkable new book and two extraordinary Australian artists. My name is Lauren Smith. I am the Assistant Director of Publishing here at the Library, and I had the absolute pleasure of working with Sylvia on this book. We're thrilled to be launching it here tonight, officially out yesterday, but this is the real spiritual start, I suppose, of the book in the public world. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I extend that respect to all First Nations people joining us. Here at the Library, a place dedicated to collecting, preserving and sharing stories, it feels especially important to honour the world's oldest continuous storytellers. For more than 65,000 years, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have cared for country, passed on knowledge, and sustained rich cultural traditions through language, art, and narrative. As we celebrate the stories held within this building, we recognise that they sit alongside the deep histories and living cultures of First Nations communities. May we continue to listen to, learn from, and walk respectfully with the traditional custodians of this land. We are, of course, here tonight to celebrate the launch of this beautifully crafted biography by Dr Sylvia Martin. Sylvia is an award-winning biographer whose work shines a light on the private lives of talented women, often women whose contributions have been overlooked or under-recognised, including Ida Leeson and Mary Fullerton. Her thoughtful, meticulous approach brings Eirene and Nora's world to life with warmth, nuance, and deep respect. Eirene Mort and Nora Weston's creative partnership spanned 6 decades, an artistic, intimate, and deeply collaborative life lived together. Their story is one of talent, innovation, companionship, and a quiet but powerful influence on Australian art and design. Together, they built a life that defied convention. They opened a professional studio in their 20s, mentored students, exhibited widely, and produced work that blended artistry and craftsmanship in ways that still feel fresh today. The library holds Eirene Mort's papers in our collection, a wonderfully rich assemblage of albums filled with drawings and verse, along with loose letters, cuttings, photographs, exhibition catalogues, book plates, artworks, and research notes. I'm delighted to share that this remarkable trove of ephemera is currently being digitised, which means that soon Eirene's papers will be accessible online to readers, researchers, and admirers around the world. Joining Sylvia in conversation tonight is Professor Frank Bongiorno, one of Australia's most distinguished historians. Frank's work explores the social and cultural fabric of Australian life, making him the perfect person to delve into the world that shaped and was shaped by Eirene Mort and Nora Weston. Please join me in welcoming Sylvia and Frank.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Lauren, for a lovely introduction. And first of all, Sylvia, congratulations on Double Act. I should also congratulate National Library too, because it's a great read, but it's the most beautiful book. I mean, as you'll see as you flick through it, I mean, it's as a book, it's a wonderful production and lavishly, beautifully illustrated.
Yes.
But I wanted to begin by asking you what prompted your interest in Eirene Mort and Nora, Kate, Chips Weston. We've already had a clue, I think, in what Lauren had to say, but I wonder if you could say a little bit more.
Yeah. It's actually not an easy question, Frank, because you go back and you think, where did this start? And I try to remember what actually set me off, you know, and I have over the years, I have files on women of the early 20th century that I think, oh, they look really interesting. And I think that I can actually go back to the photograph of the two women that's actually on the back of the book. Well, a part of it's on the back of the book. These two amazing young women dressed in new woman garb of the tie and the simple blouse and the long skirt. But it's a very intriguing photo because there's all sorts of contradictions in it. There's these beautiful plain clothes, and then there's amazing elaborate coiffure on their heads of Edwardian hairdos.
There it is.
That are incredible. And there's a lot more intriguing things in the photograph that I won't go into now, but it just caught my eye and didn't go away. And I was working on other projects at the time when I found that, and it really was quite a while before I got back to it. And in fact, 4 years today, I found out from my social media, because it reminded me, I went to Melbourne to accept highly commended Hazel Rowley Fellowship Award, which meant that I had funding, and it sort of said, Sylvia, you've got to get on with this. And also at that stage, COVID had just sort of subsided a bit. This is in 1922, and I could actually come to the National Library from New South Wales, where I live, because I couldn't get to the library before that. And so that was where this all started.
So who were they? Who were they? These talented...
Yeah.
Who were they?
They were born within 6 months of each other. In the end of... Eirene was born at the end of 1879, Nora in 1880, and they come from... Both of them come from quite illustrious colonial settler families. Eirene's great uncles were Thomas Sutcliffe Mort and Henry Mort, who had a big influence on pastoral, both pastoral parts and business, in the case of Thomas Sutcliffe Mort. And Nora, her great-grandfather was George Johnson, who came out in the First Fleet. And so her...
perpetrator of our only military coup to date, the Rum Rebellion.
I know.
Or co-perpetrator with John MacArthur, we should perhaps say. Yeah.
So they were actually very proud of their forebears. Yeah. And they both grew up in... Well, Nora grew up in Parramatta. Eirene grew up in Sydney. Nora was in much more straitened circumstances than Eirene, because her father died when she was 6 years old and left 9 children. And 9 children ranged from 21 down to 3, I think. So she had a much more difficult life. And they met when they were in their mid-20s, not quite sure how, as part of the Sydney art scene. Eirene was a multi-skilled... She was a designer first and foremost, and she was also a teacher, and she was multi-skilled in tapestry, pottery, there's so many, needlework. She had because she believed as a designer that if you were going to design, you had to be able to do whatever you were designing for. You had to know the limits of whether it be clay or stone or thread, of how you could design for these different...
Or book plates.
Ah!
There you go.
Yeah.
Another of her, yeah.
That's not hers.
That's not hers, though. Margaret Oppen,
a very interesting one. Book plates were a big thing of Irene's too. They were very, very popular in the 30s. And yes, that book plate... is quite an extraordinary one, because it says a lot about these two women's relationship, because that's a book plate for Eirene Mort, done in 1934. But it's a book plate of two women working together on this giant printing press. It's sort of an Art Deco wood engraving, and they're working in harmony, but it's a physical effort. And Nora was the complementary craftswoman to Eirene, and she was a wood carver and a metal worker and a brass worker, and they had some skills that overlapped. They both did leather work, but they really complemented each other in their skills.
You've written a number of books that explore couples, women, and I guess we would perhaps too easily use the term lesbian couples for those women today. And it has to be said, I didn't encounter Sylvia's work on this 5 minutes ago or
No,
5 years ago,
No.
but I think I was thinking this before. I think it's about 29 years ago, actually.
It's a long time.
The
I
joy
know.
of
Yeah.
I remember reading your doctoral thesis in the Griffith University Library.
Oh,
I
my
think
goodness,
it was.
did you?
I sat there reading.
Oh.
Those days, no digitisation in those days, folks. You went and did it on the spot.
It's not
It was-
online, no.
Yeah, exactly.
Frank, I didn't know that.
So I've done all that. So that one was about Mary Fullerton and Mabel Singleton, of course,
Yeah.
and you published a book on them.
Yes.
In fact, through a couple of editions too, I think.
It's got a second edition in 2021. It's the
Yeah.
first Australian
Yeah,
edition in
yeah.
2021.
Yeah,
so
wonderful. Yeah,
that was great.
And also Ida Leeson, the
Mitchell
librarian, and Florence Birch. But you know, in an Australian context, you've been someone who has indeed resisted, I think, those too easy kinds of assumptions or even questions. I remember one that you raised all the way back then. Did they do it? You know, as if that's the most important thing.
If
You know,
somebody
that
asked
very
me, did they bonk, I think.
yeah,
was
that's
the-
it. That's it. Did they bonk? That was for the British publisher, wasn't it? Using their, but you know, reductive questions,
Yeah.
unproductive questions in a way when we want to
Very.
explore the kind of complexities of the intimacies that we're talking about here, as well as the professional relationship.
Yes.
So I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about how you go
How I
about
approached
that.
that.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
I've certainly have been working in that direction for 30 years, and building on these women that I find and think, oh, that sounds very intriguing. But it sort of starts from a personal dissatisfaction, I suppose, in the 1980s when I didn't quite identify with the lesbian narratives that were around at the time. You had to be butch or femme, you had to be a separatist or a coalitionist, and I didn't quite fit anywhere there.
Coalitionist. I didn't know that.
Separatist and coalitionist.
Coalitionist. There you go.
Yeah. And so I started thinking, I wonder how women of the past who lived in relationships, they lived in long-term relationships, what sort of ideas were in the air when they were alive? And importantly, how did they breathe them in? How did they see themselves? And so that was how I've approached that. And I've found some quite extraordinary things, you know, really. Like Mary Fullerton wrote a lot of unpublished love poetry to her Mabel, that she lived with for many years. And she really does, through the poetry, say that she's part of the advance guard. And it goes back to Edward Carpenter. She really did see herself as part of an advance guard in evolution, which was a very positive way of understanding her sexuality. So I've always tried to look for where the kind of spaces that these women might have been able to inhabit positively, because they all led very productive lives. They weren't radicals. They didn't come out and announce that they were different, and they managed to fit in. And I think it was easier for women to do that because there were spaces for them where they could live as friends, but they could live as companions in a way that it wasn't possible for men to do. But there were also social areas that they could find a social community where they never had to announce, and they didn't have to announce their identity in those times as we do today. It was, you didn't go around saying, well, I'm heterosexual or I'm lesbian. You didn't do that. And so in this book, it's been a fascinating journey because I've discovered I'm not an art historian, so I've learned a great deal. And I've discovered that in Sydney, the Sydney art scene in the early 1900s, women artists and craftswomen all shared studios all around the CBD in Sydney. Nora and Eirene shared a studio in Vickery's Chambers in Pitt Street for years, and with various other women working in there too. And so there was this whole sort of, I call it a homosocial society that they were able to move in perfectly comfortably, and often in couples, sometimes not, sometimes they were married, they had husbands, and also in the teaching circles, because Eirene taught in several private schools, Kambala and Abbotsleigh, or Kambala later, Abbotsleigh, the Shirley School, and most of these schools were also run by women couples who just about the Miss So-and-so and Miss So-and-so. And they went about their lives, and they were often English, and they'd come out here and they'd do their teaching careers, and then they'd hop back to England and stay together for the rest of their lives. So it was an eye-opener for me that there was this space. I mean, I know that these women were of a certain class. They weren't poor. So they moved in sort of middle class to upper middle class circles. So that was part of the situation too.
It's really interesting the way you describe them as inhabiting the city in that way, which reminded me, just as you spoke, of the argument that the urban historian Graham Davison put many years ago about male writers in the 1890s in Sydney, of usually more humble origins, less materially affluent, I think, than the women you're dealing with. But again, evoking a kind of culture of homosexuality among those men that we probably normally call just mateship. But again, it's interesting. This is another side of the creative life of Sydney, really, from what he was talking about, but one that historians, until really your work here, have had very little
Well, the
say
art
about.
historian Juliet Pearce, she was talking about Ethel Stevens, who was another womenist group who started the Society of Women Painters, and Ethel had a female partner who was a friend or not a friend, or not just, who knows. And they knew Eirene and Nora well, Chips, and Juliet Pearce says she thinks there might have been a queer hidden history, and she wrote that before I started work on this, and I thought that is such an interesting way of putting it. And she mentions the stable partnership of Eirene Mort and Nora Kate Weston.
That's fascinating. Eirene is an artist about whom there's been growing interest the last 15 or so years, and we saw Pamela Lane is here tonight.
She's here.
Pamela produced a major thesis, as well as partnering in an exhibition. Many of you might have seen the wonderful exhibition at CMAG a decade ago, I guess, was it? Pamela would be able to tell, well, you'd be able to tell us when
2017 it was.
Oh, right, there you go.
And I have to say, 2017 was before I had ever heard of Eirene Mort, so there are people who have known her for longer than I have. But Pam did some really pioneering work on Eirene, bringing her out of the shadows. And she's been very, very generous to me in my work. I've been very grateful to her. And I wanted to go into the shadowy figure of Nora Weston that people didn't know very much about. And a lot of the work that has since we now know was collaborative work. She always saw her work as a collaboration between Nora and Eirene. And it's only now sort of being recognised that Nora had a lot to do. I can see the brass tray that is there now is actually executed by Nora Weston. It's designed, the beautiful gum blossom ends are designed by Eirene, and it's in the National Gallery of Australia, and it's always only been attributed to Eirene Mort, who was supposed to have done it all. And in fact, she didn't ever do metalwork, and that's definitely been executed by Nora. So now it has both names.
It's a different sort of perspective. And I wanted to ask you about what kind of, particularly thinking about Eirene and her work as an artist, as a designer, what kind of artist she was. I mean, the book is sort of, I hope you won't mind me saying, it's almost haunted by, I guess, modernist possibilities, isn't it? And you, unsurprisingly, you refer to a number of places Margaret Preston and make that comparison. Preston, of course, now having long, since the 70s, I guess, having now been regarded as a really pioneering modernist in Australia. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about where you see Eirene in particular fitting into, and perhaps a part of the story is Chips. Perhaps a part of the story is the kind of collaborations that she engages in, which are perhaps different from
different.
what we...
Eirene studied in England. She went to England when she was 19 by herself, which was very, very independent. And that was in 1899. And so she was being taught at the height of the arts and crafts movement by her teachers there who were involved in arts and crafts. So she came back to Australia absolutely imbued by the principles of the arts and crafts movement.
This is like William Morris,
John Ruskin, Truth to Materials,
Walter Crane,
a movement against the machine age, really. So it was back to handcrafted work, moved beyond the fine arts to architecture, to tapestry, to textiles, to wallpapers, and so it was a movement that, in a way, was good for women in that it took women's art seriously and to textiles and tapestry, and yet in another way, the women it was still hierarchical. It was William Morris, who was really, really well known. His daughter May Morris, who is now just coming into her own because she was a designer, and she designed for her father, but of course she was designed for herself too, and is now having exhibitions this century. But I think that partly because Eirene and Nora were moved, they didn't concentrate on one particular medium. They weren't painters. They spread themselves over so many different media that was where they wanted to be. And also Eirene was a teacher and a designer, and I think that she was so concerned with accuracy of design. She did do quite a bit of stylised work. She was very interested in Japanese art, and you can see the influence on some of her botanical art of the Japanese influence there. So she didn't ever move into modernism, but I think it was really intentional that she didn't. But and she was very influential in the foundation of the Arts and Crafts Society of New South Wales. Here in 1907, she was a foundation member, and Nora became an office bearer sort of more or less straight after that. Now, Margaret Preston was involved in the Arts and Crafts movement too, of the society here, but she moved in a different direction. And so while Eirene was very well known, particularly, rather than Nora, in the 1910s, 1920s, into the 1930s, she was then forgotten. She then sort of disappeared out of sight.
So in terms of that hierarchy, Sylvia, I mean, is a part of the issue here that there's a stress here on the usefulness of what's been created, the uses to which it's put in. And does that sort of fly in the face of a more romantic notion and frankly, a more masculinist notion of art?
Oh, definitely, definitely. Yeah. And Eirene moved in areas that were pretty different in that she wrote newspaper articles. She wrote a series of newspaper articles in 1907 for the Sydney Mail that came out every fortnight, and it was on every room in the house, that she did in great detail. And so she was, in a way, a forerunner of a lot of the interior design in Australia, although she's not really known for it. And she also emphasised the Australian situation. Instead of importing heavy velvet drapes, she said, we've got to use light materials. And she wanted materials that women could aspire to make themselves in their own houses, and put beautiful stencils on them of Australian flora and fauna. And so she adapted the arts and crafts influence of nature, using flowers and animals, to being an Australian. She was very adamant from the word, from as soon as she came back to Australia, to shifting it to an Australian flora, Australian fauna, which had a lot of influence.
And a real sense of an Australian idiom in a way, isn't
Yes,
there? And
yes.
I wanted to ask you about that. I mean, so she, as you say, at 19, she goes off to London and studies there, studies art there, comes under the influence of the arts and crafts movement, William Morris and co. But comes back and she does, as you say, adapt it, but it's not imitative. It's a very imaginative adaptation of those concepts to an Australian environment with lots of emphasis on Australian flora and fauna and landscape in some of the work. So, it stands, I think, doesn't it, in a kind of interesting relationship to, I guess, what we might call colonialism, because there is a sense that Britain is providing some of the standards, and yet when she looks at what's being created in Britain, she actually thinks it's inferior to what she said. This is particularly on a second trip when she goes later. They both go, in fact, they go together. And there's a sense that, in fact, the colonial product here is not inferior. And so there's a kind of a real sense of, I guess you might call it, Federation-era confidence in their sense of being Australian, and yet at the same time, of course, within a kind of a general sense of Britishness, a vague sense that we are fundamentally we're fundamentally British people, which also comes with her class, I guess, that she comes from the upper middle classes and so on. So I'm just wondering how you see that sense of identity and how it works in all this. It seems really complicated to me.
It is complicated.
It's not really the cringe, is it? It's not what dear old A.A. Phillips called the cringe.
No way was there any cringe.
And
of course, A.A. Phillips was writing later, in 1950, and sort of saying that there's still this cultural cringe, whereas Eirene and Nora were working right at the height of Federation fervour at the beginning of this new century and this so-called new country. So that while I did look to English models, they didn't ever, either of them, think of England as home. They never thought they were going home. They were very proudly Australian. And so when Eirene was studying in London in 1902, she started designing an Australian children's alphabet, which was... There had been a few done before that in Australia, but hers were quite different. And they were taken up in England. They thought was pretty extraordinary. And she was in the Workers' Art Quarterly in a magazine called The Artist. So she was actually kind of a bit of a name for herself for being different then, when she was still studying.
Yeah, I mean, Phillips ends that 1950 essay on the cultural cringe by saying that what we want is a relaxed erectness of carriage.
Yes.
And I reckon she has a relaxed erectness of carriage.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, you do bring in Dorothea McKellar at one point, and there's a sense in which she belongs to that kind of world, like that kind of outlook in a way.
Well, she belonged to the Arts and Crafts Society, and she was a woodcarver.
This is the My Country, I love a sunburned
Dorothea McKellar.
Yeah.
And I think part of the reason why she didn't have a very happy life, it depended to...
This is McKellar.
Parents. And her parents were adamant that she marry and find a suitable husband. I think she was the only daughter. Whereas I don't think Irene's parents ever... There's never a sense that they were pushing her into getting a husband. And Nora was the only daughter left at home. Her sisters and brothers were all married, and she sort of fell into the position of staying with her mother in Parramatta. So she was never being pressured into marrying. But for Dorothy McKellar, the situation was different, and I think it often was different for women too.
Yeah, and I guess you show some of the possibilities, don't you, for the new woman in Australia, in Sydney, in this period, the kinds of opportunities that were opening up. I mean, was that a surprise to you when I mean, you evoke its richness. You were talking about this before, all these studios and so on.
Yes, it was a surprise. And I mean, it was still hard, very hard work, because it was still, the art scene was still dominated by men, and it was hard to get space in exhibitions. It was hard to, certainly didn't get the prices of the male artists. And so it wasn't an easy road, but Ethel Stevens, who started the Society of Women Painters, and then Eirene actually took that over in 1920 and ran that. So it wasn't an easy road, but they did persevere. And Eirene became an etcher. That was one of the things that she was best known for. She learned etching on the second trip to England with Nora, and learned from Luke Taylor in England about 1912, 1913. And so when she came back, she was one of the very few women etchers in Australia. It wasn't considered suitable for women because it involved heavy machinery, it involved chemicals, it wasn't something that was considered really a woman's artistic form. But when the Painter Etchers Society started in 1920 with the Lindsay brothers and Sidney Long, Sidney Ewers Smith, Eirene was the only woman on the selection committee for quite some time. And there was Jessie Trail in Victoria, who was really making a name for herself. So there were a few women etchers, but it wasn't an easy road. But there was a space there.
Yeah, it's interesting.
They were forging.
Your description of it makes it sound a little bit like the way women were also kept out of the printing trade. Expensive equipment, heavy machinery, all the rest of it. It's very, very interesting. Speaking of surprises, you use the term archival jolt. I can't remember who it's attributed to.
It was this Canadian academic called Ted Bishop, and he wrote this marvellous book in the 90s, I think, called Writing with Rilke, and it's he was a Virginia Woolf scholar. And I just love that book. It's been very, very influential on me.
So what was your biggest archival jolt?
I just mentioned his big archival jolt, which was when he was sitting in the British Library, and it's when you're sitting in the library and you're going through all these folders, and sometimes it does get a bit tedious, and you don't find anything you want. And he was sitting there, and he was a bit sleepy, and he opened up and he realised he was holding a fragile piece of paper, that he was holding Virginia Woolf's actual suicide note. I mean, he knew every word in it, but he was actually holding in his hands this actual suicide note. And it talks about it as embodied knowledge, that sort of the touch of the real, which gives you this archival jolt.
That magic of the object that museums rely on.
Yeah.
So what was yours?
Mine was a sketch in one of Irene's sketchbooks. And at this stage we didn't know actually where Eirene and Nora met, because there was a family story that they'd met together in London at Alexandra House, where Eirene stayed, when they were students, and then came back to Australia together. But they didn't. I'm afraid some hard archival data shows that they weren't. The shipping lists, the Alexandra House records, the census of 1901, Nora wasn't there. Nora was in, and of course Trove has helped me here by finding what Nora was doing.
God bless Trove.
In Parramatta, going to her sister's wedding, going to her brother's wedding in 1902 when she was supposed to be in London. So, and it's one of those, it's an interesting thing because nobody ever really asked the aunts where they met. And it's interesting to reflect on why that question was never asked. Would that have opened up to personal inquiry about their lives? I don't know. I'm not making any decisions about that. But I came upon this sketchbook of Irene's, and she didn't use dates, and she mixed up in sketchbooks. She could never say this is all done at this particular period on this particular day. But this particular sketchbook did have quite a few references to Dubbo in it, in and I found out that they were in Dubbo. Nora had relatives in Dubbo. They were both there in September 1906. Thank you.
I read the book.
I wrote it, but I can't remember dates.
I read it more recently than you wrote it. So
1906, and I came upon this sketch, pencil sketch, full page one, beautiful, and it was a tree, but it was a tree roots, these sensuous sort of Art Nouveau tree roots, and I showed it to my partner Leslie, and she looked at it. She said, "It's the Lorelei tree," and we had a tree on our property that I took many photos of. We built a mud brick house in the Warramungal Ranges, and that does. I'll just say that when I remember when you wrote a review of another of my books, you said Martin is not prone to wandering into the story as a
as an individual, yes,
as an author,
as an author,
and I hope I don't wander into this story.
No, why
but I do. But there is more of me in there than in any other biography that I've written, and partly it was a link between Eirene and Nora designing their own house in 1925, actually doing all the design themselves, their own bespoke house, bespoke, a lovely word, and studio, and Lizzie and I designing our own house for two women to live in, rather than the usual, the man designs the house and the woman creates the home. So how do we look at two women doing this? So that was where that tree root was my big archival jolt of the book, and it led me in a direction that you'll have to read the book.
So it's page 75, but to be clear, it's not a tree this is the same tree, right?
Well, it seems to be. I can't be absolutely perfectly sure, but I've done a lot of work on it.
So this is near your property.
Yeah, on the property.
And it's on the property. And
Angophora tree, beautiful Angophora.
And they visited it in 1906. Extraordinary coincidence.
They certainly visited that area at that particular time. Yeah. And
So Sylvia's picture from 1996 is in the book. So you have to make up your mind. This is, as everyone will have gathered by now, it's a book that rests heavily on objects and images, more than on words, I think it'd be fair to say, or at least perhaps more than on words compared to other work that you've done.
Certainly other work,
which I guess we'd imagine to be conventional in biography. And I just wondered if you could tell us a bit about the challenges as well as the pleasures of researching and writing such a history. You're wearing one of the pleasures at the moment.
I am. I'm wearing a brooch that Nora Weston made in more than a century ago, and this is courtesy to Nora's great-niece, whom I think is here tonight, who found things of Nora's that she wasn't even sure that she had. This one she did know she had. But because Nora's artefacts were often made to sell. You know, she made jewellery, she made a beautiful little silver napkin ring with a gum blossom design, probably a gum blossom designed by Eirene. And so there are these lovely artefacts. So I'm so excited to be actually wearing one of her pieces. But yes, it was a challenge, my golly, because they lived together, they worked together, they travelled together. They didn't write any letters to each other, or if they did, they certainly haven't been kept. They didn't write diaries, so there's none of that sort of intimate writing like I had with Mary Fulton's unpublished love poems to Mabel, dated and they are to Mabel, and that was such a find, and really created a love story that was certainly new. So here I had to find a lot about even where they were when through the wonderful sketchbooks that are in the library. There's dozens of them. There's so many, and they're joy to go through. So I had to piece together their lives often through images. And there are a lot of black and white photographs. There are only Eirene Mort papers. There are no Nora Weston papers. But Nora is present right through the Eirene Mort papers, and lots of little black and white photographs that have both of them in it, and where they were travelling, and also letters by Eirene to other people, and usually they're signed "Love from Chips and Love from Chips and me," you know. So it was a story that has gradually revealed itself, hopefully.
And what about through, I mean, do you get a sense again of those intimacies through the objects themselves?
Very often through the objects, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you showed obviously the book plate produced by someone else that evokes their sense of partnership. But
yes.
Are there other particular examples that you think that really, for you, sort of spoke to that? Yeah,
when they were in England in 1912-13, they Eirene created a book. Well, she created several book plates for Nora, and she created one that is it's penciled in a sketchbook, and it has a beautiful quote, biblical quote, I think it is. No, hymn quote from a hymn about, I'll always be there, I'll be your rock. And it's a beautiful few lines. And it speaks very intimately to Nora. And she then, when that book plate became something different, when they came back to Australia, and there's a book plate from 1914, which is a very beautiful book plate that has elements of the book plate in that pencil design, but the verse is gone. And I just wonder whether it was the first time they'd actually shared a flat when they went to London on their own. They'd worked together for years, but they'd still lived at home. And so they had an independence they didn't have before. And then when they came back to Australia, they then moved in together a little while after that. But I just sort of think that space says something about their relationship. That's one example, yeah.
So we'll go to questions in a moment, but I want to ask your favourite Eirene Mort creation, and also your favourite collaboration between them. Maybe you've already told us, I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I think the brass tray is one of my favourite of their joint collaboration, except that Nora did execute Eirene's design, but one they actually created together, and it has come through.
It has come up,
as a fire screen, that beautiful, beautiful Liebert tapestry fire screen that Nora designed and did the tapestry, of course. And Eirene designed and did the tapestry, and Nora Chips did the frame, beautiful frame that it sits in. So that it really is a joint work. As far as Eirene goes, oh my God, that's a terribly difficult question.
Yeah.
But there's one that I go back to, and it's the beautiful watercolour poster that has come through of the protected wildflowers of New South Wales, which is just the most exquisite design and the colours in it of these different flowers, which I just come back to it. It's just such a beautiful piece. So probably that's one that really, really speaks to me.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Sylvia. So why don't we go to questions and yes, I'm always very bad at this. But, yeah.
We met on
Oh, sorry, we've got a microphone here. There we go. Thank you. Yeah.
Congratulations, Sylvia. David Mort. We met on our terrace in much. Message from Simon Pockley that he's got your book, but he can't get it from Melbourne. I would love to meet any Weston descendants, but carry the surname Weston or are related.
Yeah.
And I carry the name Mort, but of course I'm not a descendant of Eirene's, but congratulations, and I can't wait to buy it. But also, too, she did a wonderful sketchbook on Canberra before.
Yes.
She used to stay with her cousins at Craces at Gungahlin, and she did a wonderful sketchbook on Canberra before all the buildings vanished underwater.
Yep.
Yes. Thank you and congratulations.
Yes, she spent 7 years working on sketches in the early 1920s to be presented to the committee at the opening of Parliament in 1927 in Canberra. She wanted the record of buildings that were going or going to go, and the committee rejected it straight away and said they wanted to look ahead, not to the crumbling past. And Eirene was an established artist at that stage, so she immediately, being Eirene, organised the Painter and Etcher Societies in Sydney. Sir John Sulman arranged an exhibition in Sydney at the gallery, at the Painter and Etcher Society Gallery, and it ran concurrently with the opening of Parliament in Canberra. So.
She showed them. That might be an opportunity. We'll go to another question. The connections with Canberra are quite significant, aren't they? Could you say a little bit more about those?
Yes. She, as a child, she used to come to Gungahlin. It was called Gungahlin. Property that was her cousins had, and she visited there often as a child. And I think it's now CSIRO building, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. So she did a lot of drawing and sketching there and travelling from there and travelling around the area and then travelling a bit later with Nora when they bought a Rover.
Yes.
And they spent many years travelling around in the Rover.
Indeed.
Yeah.
There was a question. Yep, up there. Go for it.
Hi. Thanks for talking about your book. My question was more around the archival research side of things of doing books like this. Have you ever had someone that or people that you've wanted to write about, but there just simply hasn't been enough archivally to actually research to make that happen? And what has your experience been like with reaching out to families in terms of accessing the material that they hold privately?
Oh yes, I have reached out to family, and there's been some very good discoveries for this book. Yes. Yeah, it's always a tricky road, especially if you're writing about women who may have been queer. Sometimes it's difficult with family, and sometimes it's fine. And so yes, it's been. But I have found women that I haven't found enough material on. But I have been able to write an article on, but certainly not a biography.
At the back.
Congratulations, Sylvia, on another wonderful piece of research.
Thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit, please, about this very, very interesting thing of designing a house for themselves and whether it's still there in Sydney, please?
It is. It is still there. It's at 29 Wentworth Road, Vaucluse, the house that they designed for themselves. It looks very different now. I'm afraid it's had quite a lot of alterations and doesn't have quite the line that it had originally. But it had an upstairs area that had a curved roof, and the entire upper floor was their studio, their workspace and teaching space, and looked out onto the harbour. The ground floor they designed for themselves as their own private residence. The house had one bedroom in 1925. So one large bedroom, living room, dining room. So all that was necessary for a beautiful house for two women to live in and work in.
Great. Oh, no, could you just wait for the mic so everyone can hear? Yeah, thank you. Sorry. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Sylvia, it's Katie Humphreys.
Hello,
Frina
Katie.
Crace's daughter.
Yes.
Just thought you'd like to know, I've been in discussion with the Canberra Museum today about starting up a Crace archive, sort of legacy collection.
Oh, great.
And there's a dry point etching by Eirene that they've got now, and also a pencil drawing.
Oh.
I don't think they've ever been seen. I think that they would have, Mum either bought them or was given them by Eirene. So yes, they'll be hopefully in the Canberra Museum as part of a new collection.
Oh, that's marvellous, Katie. Thank you so much for coming. If there are Eirene etchings and drawings that are coming out of the woodwork that have never been seen.
Monique, I think. Yeah.
Hello and congratulations. I was just intrigued by the photograph of the two women with the wounded men.
Oh, yes.
And wondered if you could
I didn't have a
tell the
chance to
story.
talk about that at all, but there's quite a lot in the book about the war years when they, the Arts and Crafts Society women worked with wounded returned soldiers, and they worked one-on-one with them at the St Randwick Repatriation Hospital when the soldiers were there. So there's quite a lot about that in a chapter on the war years.
So teaching them to create, basically.
Yeah,
Yes.
designing.
Yeah.
Eirene designed this beautiful breadboard. There's a picture of it in the book, octagonal-shaped breadboard with a sort of Kurrajong design on it that could be done fairly simply by the soldiers in quite fairly simple wood carving, but beautiful, beautiful work.
Yes, yes.
Thank you both for an interesting discussion. You both talked earlier about the lack of authorial intrusion into this book and into your books generally. And I think it's something that in any biography is a very fine line that authors walk. Can you tell us a little bit about how difficult or easy it was to keep points of view or ideas or colour out of this book or other books that you've written?
When you say points of view, you mean my point of view? Yeah. I've always worked in anything I've written from a feminist point of view that says we all come from somewhere. This is not... It's not. I don't write biographies that are sort of written by some mysterious, omniscient author that just somehow comes onto the page. Because we all take, when we go into research, we all take our own lives in there. We all take our points of view in there. We all take the lenses that we see the world. We look through a particular prism or a series of them. And so I do, in anything I write, make sure that that is known. But I do try not to be self-indulgent, and I do try not to wander into the story unless I really am making a point that I think needs to be said. So look, there are people who can't stand authors being involved in their biographies, and one of them's David Marr. But then he writes about really well-known people, like his biography of Patrick White. I mean, you wouldn't probably wander into a biography of Patrick White. But I write about women who are not well known, who you need to lure them in to say, why should I read about these women? I don't know who they are. And so it's a very different way of writing. Yeah.
I mean, there is more of you explicitly, I think, here than probably in your previous writing, and with good reason. I mean, we've referred to one incident where there is a direct intersection. But also, I mean, you're dealing with two women who are inhabiting, who are designing domestic space that is meant to be an expression of their lives as professionals, as artists, as craftswomen, and their lives together. And it kind of made sense for you. I mean, it would have almost been dishonest in a way, or evasive. That's the word, not dishonest, evasive.
Yes.
For you not to have entered, you know, in terms of your own experience of that very process.
I just had to do it. It did come from a more personal perspective than anything else I've written. And so I tried to work out a structure where that would be clear but not invasive. And I also do try not to be judgmental. I do try not to tell readers what to think about women's sexuality. I do try not to hop in there with my judgments.
And I think that object-related, you know, the fact that it is driven by objects also kind of necessarily pushes you in the direction of, well, where did I find them? It's kind of different from the process usually of going into a library or an archive and here are some letters.
Here are the letters.
Here are the letters. I mean,
here's the diary. Oh, diaries.
It's different, isn't it? Because they're everywhere. They're all over the objects are everywhere. They're all over the place. So it is more of an adventure in that kind of sense.
It was a real journey. It was a real journey.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, please.
Thank you for a lovely and interesting talk. I noticed that Eirene lived till 1977.
Yep.
Was she influenced by modernism, by modern feminists? How did she sort of change over the years, and how did Nora?
I think I find that one hard to answer because I think they really did set on their own path and they stayed with it.
She's very old by the time women's liberation comes along.
Yes, yeah, she was. Yeah.
So,
I mean, the new women, that I would call them new women rather than feminists even, because they were really, at the turn of the 20th century, were so different from the end of the 20th century. My God, what a span. They were agitating for their own independence, to be able to work, to be able to not be reliant on being supported by a husband and being perhaps subsumed under what the husband wanted them to do or let them do. And so that it was a movement that was, but they weren't necessarily aligned with the suffragists. It was a complicated scene, as all these scenes are.
And I mean, several of your books also kind of challenge that rather crude, now outdated chronology in sexual history, which sort of says, these sorts of relationships, they're often called Boston marriages, weren't they, in the 19th century, and then sexology comes along and you couldn't really have them anymore because, that basically drew attention to the erotic nature of these relationships. And there's a kind of crude... Whereas, what you show here is, in fact, that chronology just doesn't work for these women. These women, they maintain these relationships and sensibilities for all their lives through to the 60s and 70s.
I think when Marie Stopes came along in the 1930s, the sex reformer and doctor, and she was very into heterosexual women in marriages having sex drive, but she was also very against what she called Uranians at the time, as being frigid. So lesbians didn't get a good rap there. And that was, but by the women most of the women I've written about by that stage were middle-aged women. They'd been together for donkey's years, and nobody sort of questioned them. They were still able to lead their lives, whereas I think maybe some women just were a bit later, might have had more difficulty. But yes, it's very difficult to put these periods into crude
chronologies. I will come back to you. I'll go here first, I think, yes. I hope I haven't missed... Oh, have I missed someone? Sorry, my apologies. There's someone back here first,
Thank you very much. And you mentioned earlier that you were going to talk a little bit more about that photograph. I think I'm right in saying that I noticed there was an axe and a plane in that photograph, and it's so fascinating because...
Yes, it's a performative photograph.
Those women are so beautiful as well as being
I don't kind of want
strong.
to talk too much about it here because I'm hoping you'll read the book, because I go into it in great detail in the book, that it's a mysterious photograph because it looks as though it's like a photo shoot, a modern day photo shoot, and yet the materials that they're working with, this axe, I mean, it's not a fine woodworking tool, the plane and the bit of wood, they're a bit rustic, and Eirene's sitting at what looks like an easel, but it's a theodolite stand or something like that. And she's painting with something that's not a paintbrush, and she's got this umbrella sort of artistically arranged behind her, and it's a very playful photograph, which led me down quite a path of trying to find out where it was taken, and when it was taken.
And what are they up to? I think there was one. Yes, we'll need the microphone. Thank you.
Thanks. I hope you don't mind. It's not a question about the book, but I'm a Weston descendant, as is my cousin Bronwyn and my cousin Jenny.
Yeah. So Weston descendants.
Yeah. Could we have a show of hands of the Weston descendants?
Hands up, Weston descendants. All right. So we've got some Weston descendants here. Yeah.
Okay.
What about Mort descendants? Do we have Mort? Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
Wow.
Wow.
And relations. Yeah. Relations and descendants. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. And we'll perhaps just one last question, then we will need to wind up. So, over here. No, sorry, microphone behind you. Yeah.
Can I give Sylvia, if I may, not be so rude, give a really good plug for the new Bookplate Society, which I belong to. They had a row with the old Bookplate Society years ago, so they're the new ones. But they have all Eirene Mort's bookplates on digitised, and it's fascinating. I mean, the one there was very simple, but they put, if you design someone's bookplate, it's all their things in their life, their activities. Yep. The other thing is too, if anybody lives in the Highlands, there's a little Mort's Lane off Oxley Drive, not named after other Morts, named after Eirene. And it's still there. It's one way. It's where they lived for many, many years, because she taught art at Frensham with Winifred West, and they were good friends, but she lived for many years. But the other interesting thing is, to answer your question, is that she designed, when they put out the quest for designs of decimal currency in '66 or there before, she designed, I don't think they were accepted, but I might be wrong.
Sorry, David.
The design for the decimal currency notes.
It wasn't, it was for no, it was for, wasn't for the main...
No.
It was an alternative designer.
Well, she would have been in the 90s then, or 80s.
Yeah, she was in the 90s. And she was one of the finalists in that, yes.
Yeah.
And that's written up in the book too. And a whole section on bookplates. You'll find so much about bookplates.
I learned a lot about bookplates.
I'm obsessed with bookplates.
And was reminded I have one, Luke.
I've become obsessed as well.
Yeah, no, and absolutely. Well, you learn a lot about the different genres in which they work, and that's one of them.
It's fascinating.
And thank you for letting us know about the Australian Bookplate Society and the digitisation work that they're doing.
The new Bookplate Society.
Yeah, thank you. The new Bookplate Society.
I belong to it.
Sylvia, thank you. We should thank everyone for coming out on a wet night, and particularly a warm welcome, obviously, to family and descendants. I mean, it's wonderful that you're here, and I know that the research effort has depended in all sorts of ways on their cooperation. Sylvia.
Absolutely.
So we'll head back to Lauren. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Fantastic.
Thank you, Sylvia and Frank. That was insightful and engaged. It was great. Thank you so much. One of the things that you said, Sylvia, when talking about the kind of the instigating question of your research was, I wonder why, which was a question about how women had lived, queer women had lived, in order that you might understand your present, I suppose. And Frank, you do that in your work as a historian as well, to interrogate the past. And I just want to thank you both for that work. You know, the library exists because we have questions of the past, crumbling or not. And those are important questions because it shapes our present, it helps us shape the future. And I think you have done that beautifully in this book, which we love and we are so proud to have published with you. That is the end of our conversation this evening. Sylvia will be upstairs signing copies of the book if you would like to pick up a copy from the bookshop. Thank you very much for joining us. Travel safely. Thank you.